The idea is also the insight. So what you really want to get out of these interviews is to have an contrarian insight, right?
Contrarian insight.
Contrarian insight. So something that you know is true, but the public or other people don't believe you. They don't think so. So for example, Airbnb, right? What do you think is the insight that they had back in the days? The insight that Brian Chesky had is people are actually willing to live in a stranger's house. But back in everybody now knows Airbnb is so normal. But back in the days, when he was trying to raise in Silicon Valley, most people thought he was crazy. Because why?
So I want to know about your something tips for early stage founder advice. If you have, could you please tell us?
Absolutely. Okay, I think it depends on what stage you're at. If you're still ideation stage, I would recommend a methodology called RDI, which is Research-Driven Ideation, right? And that's kind of invented by Stanford, a lecturer at Stanford Business School called Scott Brady, right? I was his student. So I think the process is super valuable, and there's a lot of great startups that came out of that process. So essentially what that means is instead of whiteboarding your idea, oh, this is gonna be cool, let's do this, you would start doing interviews, say 30 to 40 interviews with your target customers, right? Say if you wanna work with retailers, right? Just set up like 20, 30 interviews. Just ask them, what is your pain point, right? Once you've done like enough, you will have a better idea of the problems that people are dealing with, right? Because you want to build a product that your customers are so desperate to have that they're willing to pay you. Look it up online, Research-Driven Ideation, RDI. I think it's a very good process so that maybe it can save you some pivots down the line. So you know what you're working on. You're much more certain about the problem they're trying to solve. So that's my biggest advice for early stage founders. And also I think the key is also know your why, because know your why. Like, why do you want to build this? Or why do you even choose to build a startup? Because it's just incredibly hard to build a company, right? If you are a startup founder, you're just so passionate about the product you're building, right? So I think that's the second piece, is know your why. And oftentimes, my first question to every founder is, why do you build this? Sometimes I think the drive is coming from your childhood, upbringing. So really link the dots and really know who you are and what you want in life. And then you're better positioned, right? As opposed to, building a startup is really cool, let's build one. And that might set you up for an uphill battle, right?
Have you ever used RDI methodology to yourself?
Yes, we actually did. We did it. We call 390. It's an individual study project at Stanford where I teamed up with another MBA student, and we did like 40 interviews. And the problem we're trying to understand is because all these large language model companies, they're running out of data to train on. So we just try to interview Mistral, OpenAI, we did Google, different researchers to understand and scale AI to understand the data problem. There is a real gap, whether it's like real world data or synthetic data, like how it's a problem to be solved, right? So, and we wrote a report on what we learned. So I think the process is super rewarding because you want to understand the real world as opposed to your imagination, right? What is really needed out there. And there's always new problems. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I see. And how about why, like digging why, like 5 why method? Have you ever used this method to yourself? Your personal or something?
I think the why is really reflective, right? Like I'm not like asking why why every day, but I think from time to time I will just sit down and be like, hey, really know my feelings, right? How do I feel about this work? How do I feel about this job? How do I feel about the things I'm spending so much energy on? If I'm feeling great, also knowing why. Is it the work itself? Is it kind of making me feeling fulfilled or aligns with my life mission? Or if I'm not feeling well, like why? I think the why is crucial, and also it's important to kind of ask your friends, ask each other, right? Have some reality check. I think asking why is a very good habit, right? Yeah.
I love this. 10 days ago, I did 5 why method to myself because I did kind of sickness. It's called 5月病, May sickness. So in Japanese culture, April is the first semester of school and also company. And then next month, May has a long holiday in Japan. And then people are kind of mini burnout. Am I okay? Why am I doing this job like that? So I did actually same this month. So I did writing, journaling. I am a big fan of journaling. So why am I still doing this podcast?
Yeah, I think knowing the why is important. And you just reminded me of something. First of all, remember our first conversation, I asked you, why do you want to do this interview? Like, why do you have this podcast, right? I think that's always my first question. Why, right? And you just reminded me of something. Like, another advice for founder is, I'm also besides looking for your why and the idea is also the insight. So what you really want to get out of these interviews is to have an contrarian insight, right?
Contrarian insight.
Contrarian insight. So something that is true, but the public or other people don't believe you. They don't think so. So for example, Airbnb, right? What do you think is the insight that they had back in the days? The insight that Brian Chesky had is people are actually willing to live in a stranger's house. But back in everybody now knows Airbnb is so normal. But back in the days, when he was trying to raise in Silicon Valley, most people thought he was crazy. Because why, live in a stranger's home? This is nonsense. Like, what if the host is a murderer, right? So most VCs said no to him. But he had this belief that, yes, people are willing to do that. And there is a solution for that, which is the rating system.
Rating system.
Right? So that was the contrarian insight, that no one else believed him. And boom, we have Airbnb. So if you're a founder, I think it's better to kind of know your why and have your insight. Like, what's something that is true that most people don't. And sometimes if you ask people around and they think it's a bad idea, maybe it's a good sign. Yeah? Yeah.
I love that. So why method, and I found my original passion and mission is, so I am bilingual, can live in States, and then I'm Japanese citizenship, easily go back to Japan. So, and Japan has female intake is few, so I want to bridge and also encourage female people. You can reskilling, change job or challenge. Even you are over 35 or 40 years old, you can learn English, you can learn AI, like that. I want to bring some good story or role models. So this is my long-term passion and mission. How about Emery? What is your mission?
What is my mission? I think that's a great question. I think what I can tell you is what I really enjoy out of my job right now is being able to provide value and really help people. So executive at a corporation, we just had a chat 3 weeks ago. and he had a startup idea. And he's now thinking about, should I keep my corporate job or should I build that company? So we had a very long chat. And what I did is basically just asking why. How do you think about this? And he, to my surprise, has answers, very thoughtful answers for every single question I had. So I told him, I think you're ready. But he was like, well, my friends, my colleagues, my families, they all told me it's not going to work. But turns out he had a very deep understanding and he knows what he's doing. And he was just in a transition period, right? So after the chat, he made the decision. He felt really inspired. I think that was one of the best days in the past few weeks, besides Napa. So I think that's what I truly enjoy, is to being able to help people, to inspire people, and also, just linking the right startup to the right enterprise, and they move into a full commercial agreement. And yeah, that's my mission for now. I will have to think about my life mission really hard. But yeah, that was like one of the best moments. Yeah.
This is great. I think your personality also good influence, encourage to people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not only your like job part, your personality.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So speaking of your personality, so if I remember correctly, before joining Plug and Play, you were in the MBA, and before you were totally different industry, correct?
Yeah, I made pivots. My first job, I was a growth equity investor in technology, right? And closed a few deals. Average check size was 50 mil, and 3 of my portcos went public, and that was 4 years. And then somehow magic happened, and I was landed a job in Los Angeles managing a movie studio, and it was a visual effects studio, 500 people team, and we're working on movies like Avengers, Spider-Man, Black Widow, those Marvel movies. So that was a great ride. And then I decided movie was not for me because I was not the actor. So I decided to pivot again. That's why I applied to Stanford Business School. Yeah.
I see. Okay, so how do you decide? Like managing 500 people, movie industry, studio, right? Yeah. It sounds cool, but how do you feel? Maybe not mine.
That's a great question. I think everything was
like a voice from gut or from like someone's recommendation.
Yes. So I think the big decision was very, very challenging in the beginning. So imagine I was not even from the movie industry, and I jumped in as on the leadership team, and the supervisors who reported to me were like 50-year-olds, Oscar awards winning like artists supervisors, right? And I was just 20-something-year-old, never led a team before, so it was very challenging. But somehow the results was really good. And to your question, I think when you're going to make a big decision in life, listen to your gut. It's very important. Really sense how you feel about your day-to-day or the decision is very important. So I listened 4 years in and decided to pivot. And I'm really glad that I made this decision. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your precious story today, Emery.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. Yeah. This has been fun. Yes. And good luck, everybody.
Yes. Bye bye.
Thank you.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Emery, part 2. 1. Don't start with the idea. Start with research. Emery emphasizes using the research-driven ideation (RDI) method developed at Stanford to avoid building products based on assumptions. Example, instead of whiteboarding ideas, conduct 30 to 40 interviews with target users to uncover their real pain points and insights that can lead to solutions people are willing to pay for. 2. Clarity of purpose. Know your why. Successful founders deeply understand why they are building something, often tied to their personal experience or values. Example, Emery encourages founders to journal, reflect, and ask friends for reality check. A strong why provides resilience through challenges and guide meaningful decision making. 3. Contrarian insight is the secret sauce. Great startups are often built on ideas others initially reject. Example, like Airbnb's early believes that people will stay in strangers' home. Founders should seek contrarian insights, something you believe to be true, even if the world doesn't yet. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。